Today, if you have forces forward, they're easy to identify, easy to target, easy to destroy. So what's the point of having a lot of forces forward? Well, we can always reinforce them. No, you can't. How do you get across these vast oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, when your opponents have submarine fleets? How many ships do they have to sink, supply ships, transports, before everybody says, that's it, we're not going? Same thing true for aircraft. Well, we have better aircraft. We may have better aircraft, but we don't have very good air defenses. We've neglected air and missile defenses for years. In the Army, they always treated theater air and missile defense as sort of the redheaded stepchild, because we haven't fought anybody that compelled us to defend ourselves from missile and air attack. Well, those days are over. In other words, if you press this war with Russia in Central East Europe, it will reach us here in the United States. People aren't thinking about that.
How many Americans do you think are assisting or fighting on the side of Ukraine right now?
Well, I don't know, but I imagine it must be hundreds, because the President of the United States, as you know, has authorized combat pay for Americans in uniform in Ukraine. Now, didn't specifically say uniform, just said Americans serving in Ukraine. So I imagine large numbers are in other uniforms, not necessarily American. Some may be assisting contractors or working with them, but a substantial number. And again, thus far, the Russians have been very careful about not necessarily targeting them. And it would be a mistake to assume that the Russians don't know where they are. And the latest strikes that we've had over the last couple of months have been all the way out on the border with Romania, the border with Poland, the border with Moldova. Precision strikes, Kinshal missiles carrying 1,000-pound warheads. Great accuracy, very destructive. Why? The Russians are sending a message. If you think you're going to hide from us if you come in here, you're not going to do that. If you cross these borders, we will annihilate you. You'll never get to the Dnieper River. We won't permit it. And we need to come to terms with these realities, because we can't defeat it. And see, this is the sad part. Somebody will say to me, well, Doug, you don't sound very patriotic. I'm not patriotic. I put my life on the line for the country. I have no compunction about fighting or killing anybody if we need to do it. Don't get me wrong. We don't need to do this. That's the point. This is unnecessary. And if we do it,
so I think a lot of Americans suspect that maybe our military force is weaker than we think it is. You're saying it's much weaker than we think it is.
Think of it like an engine. You have a 500 horsepower engine in 1991, and the 500 horsepower engine goes from 500 to 400 to 300 to 200 down to 100. Now, you don't notice very much because you don't put the pedal to the metal. It's good enough to get to the grocery store. It's good enough to drive on 95 for 50 miles. But if you put your foot down the pedal, you're going to discover that this is a very weak engine. It's not performing very well. It doesn't have what it once had. In other words, we've gone down in the horsepower arena militarily. This is the warning. This is what people need to understand. People say, well, what about all the money we spent? That's a damn good question. You spend all this money, what are you getting for it? Where did the money go? Who's making the decisions? And you have separate services. Each service lives in its own world, has its own doctrine, its own bureaucracy, its own way of war. All this jointness is just, fugazi nonsense. And you got lots of generals, and every general has a reason to exist. And every general has 1,000 men in his headquarters, every 4-star. And every 4-star needs money for his projects. And this becomes a giant trough feeding frenzy for people on the Hill. And nobody ever bothers to stand up and say, why? What are we doing this for? I mean, just look at what's happening in Africa. Niger decided they'd had enough of their French overlords. The French retained ownership of virtually 50% of everything of value in their colonies in Afrique du Nord. Now, that's French business. Whatever the French want to do, it's fine with me. But my point is, we're involved there because we built an airstrip in Niger, and we marched in there to defeat Islamists. The truth is, there weren't very many Islamists until we showed up. Now there are lots of Islamists. What's wrong with that picture? And now it turns out the whole population, in addition to hating the French, has decided they hate us. So we've had a coup in Niger. It's now being backed by the Algerians, as well as the neighbors. And people are saying, well, we trained them. We gave them assistance, and they're turning on us. Oh, it must be the Wagner mercenaries. There aren't any Wagner mercenaries in the place. In other words, that we may have gone in there and blown it on our own, made mistakes of our own, backed the wrong horse, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't occur to anybody. Well, it must be those Russians, or maybe those pesky Chinese. We have this unfortunate habit of seeing ourselves as always wearing the white hat, always doing everything right, and we miss the truth. And the truth is, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines do what they're told. They'll go wherever you ask them to go. They'll put their lives on the line. But it doesn't always make sense. And sometimes it may be for profit, not for national interest, not for the interests of the American people. And that's the problem. And no one's been watching this thing. They see the flag, everybody salutes, everybody listens to the music, everyone's enthralled. But the old 500 horsepower engine is gone. We're down to 100 horsepower. And the 100 horsepower engine is trying to make it all over the world. It's not going very well. And we haven't even talked about our economy, obviously.